Now to a genocide in California, the systematic slaughter and enslavement during which tens of thousands of Indigenous Americans were killed, a brutality that knew no bounds and set up camps in the 1800s that had elements later seen in atrocities like that of Nazi Germany and beyond. It's a history long hidden. It's the topic of a book that was published in English a while ago, but has just become available in French. An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. Well, historian and author Benjamin Madley joins us now to tell us a bit more about it. Thanks so much for your time. And can I start by asking you, you grew up, I believe, in California. What led you to wanting to write about this part of the past?
Thank you very much for having me here this evening. So I grew up in a little town called Happy Camp near the Oregon border, very small town, the dominant population, Native people. And so while I was growing up, I got to see the conflicts ongoing between colonists and colonizers and Indigenous people in the area over things like water rights, fish, timber, and gold. And I began to hear stories about the origins of this process and the idea that my town, Happy Camp, was named not Happy Camp because so much gold was found there, but because the initial massacre that took place there was large enough to make the gold miners happy. And so I spent years of my life researching this story in archives all across the United States, from Yale to Berkeley and many places in between.
The brutality that you describe is shocking, even with what we're seeing going on in the world today. Can you give people just an idea of exactly what happened in California at the time?
So between the years 1846 and 1873, the Indigenous population in California plummeted from approximately 150,000 people to not more than 30,000 survivors. And scholars have long studied this. We've looked at starvation, we've looked at disease, we've looked at displacement. But when I looked at the archives, it became clear that this was in fact a case of state-sponsored genocide. The killings were carried out by 24 separate volunteer state militia expeditions, also by the United States Army, and finally by vigilantes. And all of this ended up being paid for first by the state to the tune of more than $1.5 million, almost all of which was then reimbursed to California by the United States Congress. So we could say that if the state of California were the architects of this man-made catastrophe, the United States government paid for almost all of the killing.
It's interesting as well to see how that hatred and fear was generated. But your book also, we were just looking at the cover of it there, and that chief on the cover, it's also about the survival and the fight back. Can you start maybe by telling us a bit more about the chief that's on the front cover of your book in English? I believe he went with, maybe 50 men to challenge that onslaught.
So the man on the picture of the English version of the book is Kintpuash, also known as Captain Jack. And this is a photograph that he sat for voluntarily at a photographer's studio in the town of Wairika in Northern California. And he would go on to lead a very small group of Modoc men, women, and children who returned to the lava beds of Northern California that they were from. And they dug in there and faced a hugely, overwhelmingly superior force of vigilantes, regular United States Army troops with artillery, and militiamen from both Oregon and California. And finally, he voluntarily surrendered, but the United States Army decided to try him in a kind of kangaroo court trial. He was ultimately hanged and then beheaded, and his head was pickled and shipped east to Washington, D.C. to be displayed there.
I mean, yeah, the barbarity at times really quite shocking. But the book, again, also about survival. You speak of, children being hidden. You speak about the fact that the population went down so dramatically in California of this Indigenous population. It did grow again, though. And, tell us a bit more about that.
So this terrible dark cloud, this specter of genocide, hangs over California's history. But at the same time, as one scholar, California Indian scholar Willie Bauer, has pointed out, the miracle of survival is worthy of marvel. So today, there are more Native American people living in California than any other state in the United States, and there are more federally recognized tribal nations here in California than anywhere else in the United States. And today, the California Indian population has rebounded to a point that equals about what it was before this genocide started.
And how is that population, how is the situation in California, and how is this history seen and this population respected in the state today?
So the state has 109 federally recognized tribal nations, more than anywhere else in the United States. And one of the recent developments here in California is that our sitting governor, Gavin Newsom, has publicly apologized for the genocide that took place here. That's a very small step, but it is an important step because we spend very little time in our educational program from kindergarten through 12th grade in California teaching our students, our future citizens and voters, anything about the history of what happened here in California. So the history of genocide in California remains, for most people in this state, very surprising. It's something they know very little or nothing about. But of course, California Indian people are very well of the catastrophe that their ancestors survived against almost impossible odds.
And of course, I'm hearing you use the word genocide, and when you look at the definition of a genocide, it certainly looks like it meets all of those criteria. And yet it's a word that is debated when we see events in the world today, and was also, I believe, debated when you used it in your book.
Yeah, so when I'm using the term genocide, I have a very specific definition in mind. So for an international prosecutor to successfully convict a defendant of genocide, they have to prove two things beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt. First, they have to prove what's called specific intent, and that's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But that's not enough to convict someone. Second, the prosecutor would have to convince the judge and jury that the defendant was guilty of at least one of the crimes enumerated in the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. And the first and most obvious crime is the crime of killing. And so the book that I've written focuses on enumerating and recording all of the killings that I could find in the archives, which total more than 16,000 deaths at an absolute minimum.
And now the horrors in your book, of course, we were saying they speak of events that happened in the 1800s, but they also describe systems and camps even, that we saw replicated, if you like, in other autocracies across the world, didn't they?
Right. So what happened in California was that a small number of temporary military reservations were set up, but these reservations were systematically underfunded by the federal government, such that people living at, for example, the Mendocino Reservation in northwestern California, while working, had to subsist on diets that at first were not more than 600 calories per day, and then after further congressional funding cuts, plunged to as little as 160 calories per person per day, which is absolutely starvation rations.
Which we do see that tactic used elsewhere. I mean, we try to learn from history, don't we? But when we look back at how the hatred was generated against this Indigenous population in California, and when you see the hatred in the world today, do you feel that we are learning from our history? Has humanity progressed at all from what we saw back in the 1800s?
Well, yes and no. My job is an educator. So one thing I can say is that I don't think there's any safe level of racism. It's a slippery slope from hate to violence to mass killing. It's something we have to be ever vigilant against and thinking about all the time. What I do think is that while we cannot bring back the dead, we can honor their memories by telling the stories of what actually happened to them, the stories that have been all too successfully buried or hidden by the killers and by their supporters and by their descendants.
Indeed, Benjamin Madley, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on France 24. Your book, American Genocide, just published this month in French. Thank you very much indeed.